the effect that abortion has on the 2022 election will most likely be best seen in the governor's election, since abortion is now left up to the states to decide. So, in this video, if you look at our website, partisanirony.com, you'll see that we already have a forecast, or we call it an outlook, for all of the governor's races that are happening this year. But in this video, I'm going to take some time to kind of explain some of those decisions that we made. So these are all the likely states and the safe states by both Democratic and Republican favored places, with the exception of, I believe, Michigan. Yeah, Michigan, I'll explain later. But basically, the reason why I guess you see the Illinois or Maryland or Rhode Island as likely and not safe Democratic states is because even though, like for the Northeast, for example, even though they typically vote Democratic in national elections, for state elections they're much more willing to vote for a Republican. I mean, the current governor of Maryland is a Republican. He's Larry Hogan. And for Connecticut almost elected a Republican nominee in 2018 to the governorship, and 2018 was a blue wave year. And the reason why is because for state politics it varies much more widely than national politics. State politics focuses on things like taxes, cost of living, and actually most primarily taxes, because in the Northeast taxes are high, and that's been an issue that many residents have complained about. If you look at this outlook that we have here for Connecticut State Senate, you'll see that that Republicans actually have a chance to take over Connecticut's Senate because of issues like taxes and cost of living. Also, if you hear stuff in the background, there's some construction going on around my area, so yeah, just bear with that. But basically, those Northeast states and Illinois, those issues are much more prevalent, so they're likely instead of safe. So those are mainly the explanations. I mean, Florida, a lot of Democrats do want to take back Florida's governorship from Ron DeSantis, but that's just not happening because the Florida Democrats are in shambles. They have been for several years now. And Ron DeSantis, even though initially his COVID policies might not have been popular, he's now a very popular governor in his state. So ultimately, Florida is going to be likely. Texas is the suburban areas of Texas are going to most likely go toward the Republican Party just because they are super dissatisfied with Joe Biden at this moment. So those are the likely states, except for Michigan. Michigan is actually a likely state and not a lean state for us, and that's primarily because Gretchen Whitmer is a good candidate. She's been able to do a lot for Michigan, so much so that to the point where Michigan is now rated the best state in terms of economics out of any states in the United States. And then the second factor is her opponents are just bad. Her main opponent is either Ryan Kelly, who is being charged by the Justice Department for breaching the Capitol during January 6th, or it's Tudor Dixon, a conservative conservative pundit who hasn't had much name recognition and hasn't held a statewide or any elected position in general before this race. So both of the Republican frontrunners, they're just bad candidates. And Gretchen Whitmer has been able to do tangible actions for Michigan, and because of that, we think it's going to be likely instead of lean or tilt for the Democratic Party. So those are the likely and safe states. Moving on to the lean states. So let's start with the Democratic side. There are a bunch of lean states. And that's because you have both a mix of Democrats in Democratic states with more Republican local policy values, and as well as competitive states. So Connecticut, Maine, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. These are all the lean states that we have in our outlook. And just quickly going through them, we have Oregon and Maine and New Mexico. These are all pretty Democratic states, as well as Connecticut. But when it comes to state politics, there are a lot more different issues. There are a lot different of a different issue at play compared to national politics. For Maine, it's about the environment, as well as fishing, education, and currently all of these issues favor the Republicans right now. The economy in Maine has been stagnating for some time now, and because of that, people are a lot more willing to exploit fishing in Maine, especially given the fact that you have globalization that is causing the fishing industry to become much more uncompetitive for the state of Maine. And then you also have education. A lot of people in Maine care about that right now, especially as 1 year ago, all Maine's children were in captivity for virtual learning, and many parents are angry at Janet Mills, the incumbent governor, for prolonging that period. So because of that, Maine is a competitive state. Similar thing to New Mexico with education, but also poverty. Poverty is a big issue in New Mexico, and at this point, a lot of people want change, and that's why New Mexico is rated lean. For Oregon, as you know, during the 2020 riots, it's debatable whether it's called if it's riots or protests, but nonetheless, the activities that happened in Portland during the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of ticked off a lot of suburban Democrats in the Portland region, and Kate Brown is a relatively unpopular Democrat in her state. Kate Brown, by the way, is the incumbent governor, and she was elected in 2018 by just 7 percentage points. That's a very low margin, considering that Oregon in 2018 was generally blue in the congressional races and other races, and in general they're a blue state. But you can see here in both elections, Kate Brown has not done as well as the statewide margins that you expect from this state, and generally that actually kind of is a trend for the Democrats, where in the gubernatorial election, Oregonians are much more likely to vote for Republicans than in federal races from Oregon. So that explains why we rate that as lean. Now for the Rust Belt states, just like blitzing through them, Minnesota, Tim Walz is a relatively popular governor, but Minnesota has been trending red in its outer Twin Cities region. If you look at the Iron Range up north, their economy has been slowing down, and because of that, a lot of it's like other Rust Belt states. There are a lot of voters who are now wanting to change, and with Donald Trump coming in during the 2016 elections, they felt like they could be attached to the Republican Party. Same thing for southeast Minnesota, and as well as the greater Minnesota region. Both of these areas, they're farming. It's been reliably Democratic because of the DFL movement, the Democratic Farmer Labor Movement that has dominated this state for several decades. But because of the populism that Donald Trump brought, a lot of them have flipped to the Republican Party. For Wisconsin only voted for Joe Biden by 0.48%. So it's one of the most likely states to flip in 2022 in terms of the governor's race. But the reason why we do rate it as a lean Democratic is because Wisconsin has a history of incumbency protection. If you look at the 2018 governor's election in Wisconsin, Tony Evers did flip this race from Scott Walker, who was the incumbent governor, but he was very unpopular at that time, and he only lost by 1%. And if you look at Ron Johnson during the 2016 election, he didn't flip. If you look at any other incumbent Republican in the 2018 election, didn't flip. And that's just because Wisconsin does have a favorability towards incumbents, which is why we rate it as lean Democratic. And then the final Rust Belt state, Pennsylvania. it does have a term-limited Democrat, Tom Wolf, who is pretty popular with the majority of Pennsylvanians. But the reason why it continues to be Democratic is because, first, Josh Shapiro is a relatively good candidate, has high name recognition, especially after the 2020 election, where he went on the airwaves to talk about his state, and generally is a moderate, which appeals to suburban voters. And then the other thing, Doug Mastriano, like the Michigan candidates, are incredibly bad Republican choices. Doug Mastriano has proposed alternatives, an alternative slate of electors during the 2020 election that would favor the Republican Party, that would favor Donald Trump, and he proposes the same thing for 2024 if Donald Trump does happen to run for re-election. So because of those more off-brand views, and because he is a governor for a statewide race, and statewide races generally ask in competitive states for more moderate candidates, if you look at the polls here, Josh Shapiro has been leading them, albeit not by that much, but because of Mastriano's views and because Shapiro is a relatively good candidate, it's a lean Democratic race. And in Connecticut, we talked about that earlier with Rhode Island. Taxes are a big issue, especially in Connecticut, and that's why you see that as lean Democratic. Again, if you look at 2018, as I mentioned earlier from Connecticut, you saw that Ned Lamont, who is the incumbent governor of Connecticut, he won by only 3 percentage points against Bob Stefanowski. And Stefanowski is running for re-election, which technically is a disadvantage. Not running for re-election, he's running again, which is a disadvantage. But ultimately, Connecticut, with the issues of inflation as well as taxes, and if you look at the New Jersey race from 2021, Connecticut could be a sleeper race that many wouldn't expect to be competitive. And then finally, we have these 3 states. These are all lean Republican states. And going through them, let's talk about why. So first, we have Kansas. Kansas, you might expect Kansas to actually be a relatively safe race for the Republican Party, but the incumbent governor is a Democrat, Laura Kelly. And the reason why Laura Kelly is currently the governor of Kansas is because in 2018, she won against a very, very bad Republican candidate. The Republican candidate was Chris Kobach, and he had a ton of baggage. He had a ton of baggage and a ton of controversies for his views as well as for his scandals. And because of that, he lost the 2018 election against Laura Kelly by 5 percentage points. It was so much to the point where there was an independent who gained traction and won 6.5% of the vote. So now fast forward to 2022. Laura Kelly is a pretty popular pretty popular candidate or governor in Kansas. And that's pretty surprising, but statewide politics are a lot more different than national politics. So if you look at the polling here, Kelly, even though she is very popular, Republicans do have a stronghold over this or they do have a lock over this state, and because of that, she does have an uphill battle. If you look at the polls here, they're all partisan polls, so we don't have any nonpartisan polls that can give us less bias. But if you look at both of them, in this Democratic poll, she's only up by 3 percentage points, which is within the margin of error. And Democratic polls obviously skew more towards the Democrats typically, and the Republican polls skew more towards the Republican side. But you can see here that, I mean, it's a red wave year, and Kansas is a Trump plus 15 or so state. So that's a very uphill battle for Governor Kelly. And then you also have Georgia. A lot of people want Stacey Abrams to win, especially people outside of Georgia. But the thing is, Brian Kemp appeals to moderates, and Stacey Abrams, at this point, she is seen as a more polarizing figure given her work in vote activism. And because of that, she is most likely not going to win, especially because she didn't win in 2018, which was a blue wave year. So it's highly unlikely that we'll see Abrams win this year. But what she is doing is obviously good for the Democrats by keeping this race competitive. If it was anyone other than Stacey Abrams, I would see this race as a lot less competitive. And then finally, we have Arizona. And okay, so let's talk about Arizona quickly. So Arizona, the reason why we rated that lean Democratic is because Carrie Lake, who is the front runner right now, she's not really the best candidate for moderates in Arizona or for the Republican Party in general because she doesn't appeal to moderates. A lot of her views in the Republican primary have been on how the election was stolen in Arizona, or at the very least how there was cases of fraud. And that generally won't really bode well with moderate voters. The other thing is that Katie Hobbs is on the receiving end of that, and she has a ton of name recognition from those events during the 2020 election. She put herself on the airwaves just like Josh Shapiro did in Pennsylvania, and because of that, she is polling quite favorably in her primary. And if you look at the polls here, she's led in all but one of these polls, which is a Republican pollster. Obviously, we need more data to make a more concise viewpoint, but considering that if you look at the Senate race in Arizona for 2022, Mark Kelly is favored to win that race by lean margins. And if you look at the congressional races where you have strong candidates like Tom O'Halloran who are trying to pick up the nationwide Democratic slack, and it's reasonable to rate Arizona as lean Democratic. Now, this outlook doesn't show it here, but Alaska, we actually rate it as lean. And the reason why we rate it as lean right now is because Mike Dunleavy is not super popular with Alaskans at this moment. If you look at the issues in Alaska, it's mainly poverty, so the high cost of living in Alaska, and then the environment. So this pertains more to the cost of living, but basically Dunleavy he proposed back in 2018 a bunch of promises on a welfare system of like a universal basic income similar to Andrew Yang's plan in the 2020 election, and that's how he won against Mark Begich. He basically promised Alaskan voters stuff that he couldn't really actually deliver in principle. So now we skip forward to 2022. There are some paycheck programs for Alaska, which are popular with Alaskans, but it's a lot more muted than what people expected after they elected Dunleavy against Mark Begich in 2018. And because of that, he is not polling quite heavily, as heavily as he should be in the Alaskan polls. And considering that Alaska has implemented ranked choice voting, which allows these candidates to coalesce in one candidate, all of these votes to coalesce with one opposition candidate to Mike Dunleavy, it is very popular. It is very possible that this race could get super competitive. So those are all the decisions that we made for this month's outlook. Democrats have 24 of the states, while Republicans have 26. And that's the end. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.